Crawl, old man. Go on. Crawl your way home. Brandon spat on the toe of my work boot, grabbed my custom titanium forearm crutches out of the back door, and hurled them over the steel guardrail. I heard them clatter against the rocks 70 feet down before splashing into the raging, ice-cold torrent at the bottom of Blackwood Pass. I was 74 years old. I was 18 days out of a full hip reconstruction. I couldn't keep my balance for 3 seconds on that slick mud without those crutches, and Brandon knew it. He had watched me grimace through physical therapy in my own living room for 2 straight weeks. He grinned down at me through the sheeting rain, his face illuminated by the harsh crimson glare of the truck's tail lights. "You're done leeching off us, Elias. Have a nice walk." And then, from inside the cab, my daughter Chloe leaned across the console. My Chloe. The girl I had stayed up with through feverish nights when she was 7. The girl whose college tuition I had paid in full with 40 years of sweat on timber rigs. She didn't look scared. She didn't look ashamed. She leaned out into the pouring rain, wiped her mascara, and laughed. A sharp, shrill sound that cut straight through the thunder. "Bye, Dad!" she yelled, her voice dripping with venom. "Maybe a black bear will find you before the frost does. You're an absolute embarrassment to this family!" Brandon slammed the passenger door shut. The heavy 4-wheel drive engine roared. The tires churned up mud and gravel that pelted my face, and their white pickup vanished into the blinding wall of the mountain storm. They left me standing on one leg in the pitch-black freeze, clinging to a rusting guardrail on an abandoned logging pass, miles from the nearest house. They thought I was finished. They thought my 300-acre timber property and my $700,000 in liquid savings were finally theirs to split. What they didn't know was that 2 hours later, when they pulled back into my gravel driveway after celebrating over prime rib at a steakhouse, I was already inside. I was sitting in my favorite leather armchair in front of a roaring hearth, wearing dry clothes, drinking hot black coffee, flanked by 2 armed state troopers and my oldest friend from the military. And when Brandon unlocked the front door and saw me sitting there calmly in the warm firelight, every drop of blood drained out of his face. I raised my coffee mug, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "Put your hands where the officers can see them, Brandon. You've got some explaining to do." To understand how a crippled 74-year-old man got off a freezing mountain pass in a flash flood without crutches and beat his betrayers home, you have to know where I came from. My name is Elias Thorne. I spent 36 years running heavy machinery in the Northwest Timberwoods, felling cedar and hauling timber up grades that would make a mountain goat think twice. Before that, when I was 19 years old and didn't have sense enough to be scared, I served 4 years in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I wasn't a decorated war hero. I didn't come back with chest full of ribbons or fancy war stories. But the Army taught me 2 fundamental truths that stay in a man's marrow until the day they dig his grave. First, panic kills you 10 times faster than the weather does. Second, you never, ever leave a man behind in the mud. After my wife, Martha, passed away 4 years ago from heart failure, the silence in my home felt louder than a sawmill. We had been married for 42 years. When she went, a piece of my chest went straight into the dirt with her. That was when Chloe and her husband Brandon started coming around more often. At first I thought it was kindness. I wanted so desperately to believe it was love. Brandon was a slick-talking mortgage broker who wore $300 shoes and talked constantly about high-yield investments and country club memberships. Chloe had changed over the years. The sweet girl who used to help me plant tomatoes had turned into a woman who couldn't stop looking at her phone, constantly comparing her life to people on the internet who had bigger houses and newer cars. "Dad," Chloe had said to me over lunch about 6 months back, laying her soft hand over my calloused knuckles, "you're getting older. That big property on the ridge is too much for you to maintain alone. Brandon and I could move in, help you manage the estate and take care of the bills so you don't have to stress." I was lonely. God help me, I was so lonely that I let my guard down. I let them move into the guest wing. I let Brandon set his computer up in my study. I even gave them joint signing authority on my primary checking account so they could pay the property taxes and contractor bills while I was preparing for my hip operation. It took me less than 3 months to realize I hadn't welcomed family into my home. I had invited a pair of vultures. It started with small, subtle disrespects. Brandon would talk over me at dinner. Chloe would make offhand comments about how slow I was walking, or how my old work clothes smelled like sawdust and diesel. Then Brandon started asking pointed questions about my land titles, my private safe, and whether I had finalized my last will and testament. 18 days ago, I went in for total hip replacement surgery. The joint was shot from 4 decades of jumping off bulldozers. The operation was a success, but the rehabilitation was brutal. I was on strict medical orders not to bear full weight on my left side for a month. 4 days ago, I caught Brandon in my private study with his phone out, taking photographs of my land deeds and my bank statements. When I confronted him, he didn't even flinch. He just gave me a cold, arrogant smirk. "Face reality, Elias," he said, stepping right into my personal space. "You're 74. You're broken down. You can barely walk to the bathroom without whining. Chloe and I are putting you in a specialized care facility over in Silver Creek next week. We've already filled out the preliminary intake forms." "Silver Creek?" I rasped, gripping my crutches until my knuckles turned white. "That place is 3 hours away in the valley. It's a lockdown dementia ward." "It's where you belong," Brandon whispered softly, leaning down so his breath brushed my ear. "And once you're safely tucked away, Chloe and I will handle the land sale. We already have a developer offering $1,800,000 for the timber rights. You had your turn, old man. Now step aside." I told them no. I told them to pack their bags and get out of my house by Friday. I told them I was calling my attorney, Arthur Vance, first thing in the morning to strip their access from my bank accounts. That was my mistake. I gave them warning. That very evening, under the pretense of taking me to an urgent late-night consultation with the physical therapist in the next town, Brandon convinced me to get into his heavy 4-wheel drive pickup. Chloe sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, refusing to look me in the eye. Instead of taking the highway, Brandon turned onto Old Logging Road 9, a deserted, unpaved gravel trail that snakes up Hawthorne Ridge. Halfway up the pass, in the middle of a torrential downpour, he pulled over onto the shoulder, stepped out, opened my door, and dragged me out into the storm. Standing there on one foot in the freezing slush, watching their red taillights vanish into the dark, the pain in my newly operated hip was like a red-hot spike driven through my pelvis. The rain was coming down sideways, mixed with sleet, soaking through my heavy canvas jacket in less than 2 minutes. The storm was howling off the peaks, dropping the temperature toward freezing fast. A lesser man might have laid down in the mud and wept. A man who had never faced down a mountain or spent 40 years fighting heavy timber might have given up right there. But as I stood there, holding on to that freezing steel guardrail, soaking wet and shuddering from the cold, the sheer injustice of it ignited a fire in my gut so hot that it burned away the physical pain. They want me to die out here, I thought, my teeth chattering so hard I could hear them over the wind. They want the hypothermia to do their dirty work so they can claim it was an accidental fall. "Not tonight," I gritted out loud through clenched jaw. "Not tonight, you son of a bitch." I knew I couldn't walk down that mountain on one leg. The road was 3 miles of steep gravel incline before it hit the county highway. If I fell into the ditch, I would freeze to death within 45 minutes. So I didn't try to walk. I used the guardrail. I hooked both my arms over the top rusty steel rail, keeping all my weight on my good right leg and my upper body strength, dragging my left leg behind me like a sack of wet sand. Inch by inch, foot by foot, I hauled myself along the metal barrier, moving down the mountain road in the pitch black. Every single movement sent sharp jolts of lightning up my left side. My hands went numb within 10 minutes. The sleet froze in my hair. But I kept moving. 10 feet, 50 feet, 100 yards. I counted every single step out loud to keep my mind focused, shouting into the teeth of the gale. 1, 2, 3, you don't get my house. 4, 5, 6, you don't get my land. I had dragged myself nearly 400 yards down the pass when I saw the faint yellow glow of headlights crawling up the winding road below me. In a storm like that, on a road like Old Logging 9, nobody drove unless they had a damned good reason. I didn't care who it was, a poacher, a lost tourist, or a county road worker. I hauled myself around the end of the guardrail, leaned my back hard against a massive Douglas fir tree, raised my right arm into the air, and started yelling with every ounce of lung power I had left. The vehicle was a beat-up, dark green 1998 Ford F-250, equipped with a heavy steel snowplow bracket on the front bumper. It was traveling slow, picking its way through the mud and falling rocks. The bright beams swept across the tree line, caught my soaked figure, and slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded 6 feet in the gravel before coming to a complete halt. The driver's side door swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man wearing an oilskin duster and an old felt Stetson hat stepped out into the rain, holding a high-powered flashlight. "What in the hell?" A deep, gravelly voice barked across the storm. "Hey, don't move. Who's out there?" The beam of light hit my face. The man stopped dead in his tracks. He lowered the flashlight 3 inches, his eyes widening under the brim of his hat. "Elias?" he roared over the thunder. "Elias Thorne? Is that you?" I recognized that voice before my brain even processed his face. It was a voice I hadn't heard in nearly 15 years, but one that was etched into my memory forever. It was Master Sergeant Frank "Huck" Huckabee. Frank Huckabee had been my squad leader in the Army Engineers back in 1972. He was 76 years old now, built like an old oak stump, with a face carved out of granite and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. He lived up on the far side of Hawthorne Ridge, running a small engine repair shop and keeping to himself. Frank didn't ask stupid questions. He didn't stand around gaping. He saw my dragging left leg, saw my soaked clothes, and saw the hypothermic shivering racking my frame. In 3 massive strides, Frank was at my side. He grabbed me under my shoulders with grip strength that could bend steel pipe, ducked his broad shoulder under my right arm, and took my full weight without taking a single step back. "I got you, Thorne," Frank growled into my ear, his voice steady as an anchor. "I got you. Easy now. Let's get you in the warm." He practically carried me across the muddy road, pulled open the passenger door of his Ford, and hauled me up into the heated cab. He slammed the door, ran around to the driver's side, climbed in, and turned the heater fan up to maximum blast. He pulled an old woolen army blanket and a thermos of hot coffee out from behind the seat, wrapped the blanket tightly around my shoulders, and shoved the steaming cup into my trembling hands. "Drink it," Frank ordered. "All of it. Now tell me what in the name of God you're doing on Hawthorne Pass in a flash flood without a vehicle." I took 3 big swallows of the hot coffee, feeling the heat spread slowly back into my chest. My hands were shaking so hard the liquid spilled over the rim, but I looked Frank right in the eye. "Brandon and Chloe," I rasped, my voice thick with ice and anger. "They took me out here under a lie. Brandon threw my crutches off the drop-off into Blackwood Creek. Chloe laughed. They left me to freeze so they could take my timberland." Frank sat perfectly still in the driver's seat. The dashboard lights cast a hard, amber shadow across his weathered jawline. For 5 full seconds, the only sound in the truck was the heavy thud of the windshield wipers pushing sleet off the glass. When Frank spoke again, his voice had dropped an octave. It wasn't loud. It was soft, terrible, and utterly lethal. "They threw your medical crutches over the rail?" Frank asked quietly. "Your own daughter watched him do it?" "She laughed, Frank," I whispered, the bitterness tearing at my throat. "She told me to let a bear eat me." Frank slowly reached out, put his truck into gear, and executed a sharp 3-point turn on the narrow mountain road, turning the Ford's heavy nose back down toward the valley. "Where are we going?" I asked, leaning back against the headrest as the cabin heat began to thaw my frozen skin. "We're going to your house, Elias," Frank said, staring straight out through the rain-streaked glass. "And on the way down this mountain, we're making 2 phone calls. First one is to Sheriff Miller on his private line. Second one is to your brother-in-law, Trooper Warren Vance." Frank glanced sideways at me, a cold, ruthless smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Those 2 fools think they just committed the perfect murder," Frank said quietly. "They think they're going to sit down, pour a glass of your expensive whiskey, and celebrate. They don't know who picked you up." By the time Frank's truck turned down my long gravel driveway 25 minutes later, the storm had begun to recede into a steady gray drizzle. My 300-acre property was pitch black, save for the porch lights I always left on. Brandon's white pickup wasn't in the driveway yet. "They stopped in town," I said, my voice hardening as the warmth returned to my limbs. Brandon always goes to the Copper Grill on Thursday nights when he thinks he's got money to burn. They're sitting down to a $70 steak right now, while they think my corpse is cooling off on Hawthorne Pass. Good, Frank said, pulling his truck around to the back entrance so it wouldn't be visible from the main road. Let 'em digest their meat. It'll make what comes next hurt worse. Frank helped me out of the cab and up the back porch steps. He guided me into the mudroom, where I stripped off my soaked canvas coat and muddy boots. He brought me an old pair of dry sweatpants, a heavy flannel shirt, and a spare pair of wooden underarm crutches I had kept in the workshop from an old ankle sprain 5 years ago. 10 minutes later, the front gates opened. A high-powered state police cruiser silently glided down the driveway, its lights completely dark, followed by a second county sheriff vehicle. Trooper Warren Vance, my late wife Martha's younger brother, stepped out of the cruiser. He was 6'2", 48 years old, with stern blue eyes and a jaw that looked like it was made for a mugshot. Beside him was Sheriff Jim Miller, a 30-year veteran of the county force who had known me since we played high school football together. Warren walked into my kitchen, saw me standing there on my wooden crutches with Frank Huckabee beside me, and his face turned red with quiet fury. "Elias," Warren said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "Frank called me on the radio. Tell me every single word. Don't leave out a detail." I sat down at the heavy oak kitchen table and told them everything. I told them about the land deeds Brandon had photographed. I told them about the dementia ward in Silver Creek. I told them about the lie to get me into the truck, the exact spot on Old Logging Road 9 where Brandon dragged me out, the titanium crutches thrown into Blackwood Creek, and the exact words my daughter spoke before they drove away. When I finished, Sheriff Miller pulled out a small black notebook, recorded the exact time, and looked over at Trooper Vance. "Reckless endangerment in the first degree," Sheriff Miller said coldly. "Attempted second-degree murder, abandonment of a vulnerable adult, felony theft of medical equipment. That's a minimum 7-year sentence on the primary charge alone." "What about Chloe?" I asked, my voice wavering for the first time. "She didn't drive the truck, Warren. She didn't touch the crutches." Warren looked at me with deep sympathy, but his voice was firm as granite. "Elias, she actively participated in coaxing you into that vehicle under false pretenses. She sat there while he threw your mobility devices into a ravine in a freezing storm. She cheered him on and left you to die. In the state of Washington, that makes her a full co-conspirator to attempted murder. She's just as guilty as he is." I closed my eyes for 3 long seconds. The memory of her sharp, shrill laugh rang in my ears again. "Do what the law requires, Warren," I said softly, opening my eyes. "No favors, no exceptions." "Where do you want to wait for them, Elias?" Frank Huckabee asked, laying his thick hand on my shoulder. I looked toward the front living room, toward the large brick fireplace and the big leather wingback chair where I had sat with Martha for 40 years. "In my chair," I said firmly, standing up on my wooden crutches. "Right where I belong." We set the stage with methodical precision. Sheriff Miller and Trooper Vance parked their marked police vehicles 300 yards down the driveway, tucked behind the old tractor shed in the dark, where they couldn't be seen from the main road. Frank Huckabee sat silently in the darkened dining room, positioned right beside the heavy oak door with a pocket knife in his hand, whittling a small piece of pine to pass the time, completely invisible from the front entrance. I turned on the lamps in the living room, threw 2 dry logs onto the fire, and sat down in my leather armchair. I placed a steaming mug of black coffee on the side table beside me, adjusted my wooden crutches so they were resting casually against the armrest, and waited. At precisely 10:45 p.m., double headlights swung into the driveway. I heard the heavy engine of Brandon's white pickup rumble to a halt on the gravel outside. I heard the truck doors slam. Then I heard their voices coming up the front porch steps. They were laughing. "I'm telling you, babe." Brandon's voice carried clearly through the heavy front door, relaxed and arrogant. "We call the lawyer tomorrow morning at 9. We report him missing by noon. We tell the sheriff he must have wandered off during his recovery. By next month, the timber contract is signed, and we're looking at beachfront property in Oregon." "I just hope the search team doesn't drag it out," Chloe's voice chimed in, accompanied by the clink of her house keys. "I don't want police swarming the house for a week. It's so exhausting." The brass deadbolt clicked. The heavy oak front door swung open. Brandon stepped inside first, shaking rain off his expensive leather jacket. Chloe followed right behind him, carrying a bag of takeout desserts from the steakhouse. Brandon took 3 steps into the foyer, turned toward the living room to flip on the main light switch, and froze dead in his tracks. His jaw dropped wide open. The color drained out of his skin so fast, he looked like a linen sheet hanging on a clothesline. The keys slipped out of his numb fingers and hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, metallic clatter. Chloe ran right into his back, nearly dropping her takeout bag. "Brandon, why did you stop?" She cut herself off. Her eyes traveled past Brandon's shoulder, across the rug, and landed directly on me. I was sitting comfortably in my chair. The fire was roaring behind me, casting long amber light across the room. I raised my coffee mug calmly, took a slow sip, and set it back down on the saucer. "Evening, Brandon," I said, my voice smooth, quiet, and completely steady. "Evening, Chloe. You're home late. Did you enjoy your steaks?" For 6 excruciating seconds, nobody moved. The house was so quiet you could hear the mantel clock ticking. Brandon's eyes darted frantically around the room, staring at my dry clothes, my wooden crutches, and my completely calm face. His brain was desperately trying to process how a crippled old man he had left on a freezing mountain peak 2 hours ago was sitting in front of him, alive. Elias?" Brandon stammered, his voice squeaking like a frightened rodent. How are you... How am I here?" I finished the sentence for him, leaning forward slightly in my chair. "Did you think Blackwood Creek was going to swallow me whole, Brandon? Did you think a 74-year-old man who worked 36 years in the timber woods was just going to lay down in the mud and die because you threw his crutches away?" Chloe made a choked, gasping sound in the back of her throat. She took a step backward toward the open door, her face pale with absolute terror. "Dad," she whimpered, her voice suddenly switching back to the soft, innocent tone she used when she was 10 years old. "Dad, oh my God, we were coming back for you. We just went to get help. We got panicked because the truck was slipping on the ice." The sheer, shameless audacity of the lie was almost breathtaking. "You went to get help at the Copper Grill?" I asked softly. "You got panicked, so you sat down and ordered the prime rib while you waited for the frost to finish me off?" Brandon suddenly recovered his footing. A dark, desperate rage flashed across his face. He took 2 aggressive steps into the living room, closing the distance between us, his fists clenching at his sides. "Listen to me, you old bastard," Brandon snarled, dropping the polite act entirely. "I don't care how you got back here. You don't have a shred of proof. It's your word against ours. We'll tell the cops you're senile, that you hallucinated the whole thing, that you slipped in the mud and lost your mind." "Is that right?" A deep, gravelly voice echoed from the shadows of the dining room. Frank Huckabee stepped out from the dark doorway, his massive frame blocking the hall. He folded his pocket knife shut with a loud, terrifying snap. "What about my word, son?" Frank asked, his eyes cold as Arctic ice. "I'm Master Sergeant Frank Huckabee, United States Army retired. I picked Elias up off Logging Road 9 at 8:42 p.m. I took high-resolution photos of his mud-soaked injuries, his frozen clothes, and the tire tracks your F-250 left on the shoulder when you dragged him out of the cab." Brandon spun around, his face turning from white to ash gray as he looked at Frank. "Who the hell are you?" Brandon yelled, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Get the hell out of this house! This is private property!" "Actually, Brandon," I said quietly, pointing a finger toward the foyer behind him, "it's my property, and you have some other guests arriving." Before Brandon could react, heavy footfalls slammed onto the front porch. Trooper Warren Vance and Sheriff Jim Miller burst through the open front door, their handguns drawn at low ready, their uniforms imposing in the bright entry lights. "Stay right there! Don't move!" Warren roared, his voice shaking the framed pictures on the wall. "Brandon Lond, step away from Elias Thorne right now! Put your hands on top of your head!" "Warren!" Chloe shrieked, backing into the corner of the foyer, her hands flying to her mouth. "Warren, it's a mistake. Brandon didn't do anything. Dad is confused." "Shut your mouth, Chloe," Trooper Vance barked, his eyes blazing with disgust as he stepped past her. "I heard every word you said through the living room wire. Sheriff, take the male suspect." Sheriff Miller slammed Brandon face first against the heavy oak coat rack. Brandon let out a pathetic, high-pitched grunt as his arms were wrenched behind his back and a pair of steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. "Brandon Lond," Sheriff Miller read his rights in a flat, ruthless monotone. "You are under arrest for attempted second-degree murder, felony reckless endangerment of a vulnerable adult, and grand larceny of medical equipment. You have the right to remain silent." "Elias, tell them to stop!" Brandon screamed, his face smashed sideways against the wood paneling, tears of pain and terror suddenly streaming down his cheeks. "Elias, we can talk about this. I'll leave. I'll give up the signing authority. Just don't do this. I'll go to prison." "You should have thought about prison before you threw my crutches into Blackwood Creek," I said, cold and clear, looking him straight in the eyes. "Take him out of my house, Jim." As Sheriff Miller dragged a sobbing, cursing Brandon out the front door, Trooper Vance turned to my daughter. Chloe was cowering against the wall, her expensive clothes disheveled, tears ruining her makeup. She looked at me with wild, desperate eyes, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "Dad, please," she begged, dropping to her knees on the hardwood floor, sobbing hysterically. "Please, Dad, I'm your daughter. I'm your little girl. He made me do it. Brandon made me say those things. I was scared of him." I stood up slowly from my leather armchair, relying heavily on my wooden crutches. I walked across the living room rug, stopping 3 feet away from where she knelt on the floor. I looked down at my only child, the baby I had rocked to sleep during thunderstorms, the girl I had held in my arms when her mother passed away. "You laughed, Chloe," I said. My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was just hollow, a terrible, empty sound that seemed to drain the remaining warmth out of the room. I was standing on one leg in a freezing storm, bleeding into my own boots, and you laughed. You told me to let a bear eat me. "I didn't mean it," she wept, reaching out to grab the hem of my sweatpants. "I was stupid. I was confused. Please, Dad, don't let them take me." I stepped back out of her reach. "I spent my whole life giving you everything I had, Chloe," I said softly. "I worked double shifts in the rain so you'd never know what want felt like, but you didn't see a father who loved you. You just saw a bank account and a piece of land waiting for a corpse." I looked over at Trooper Vance. "Take her away, Warren." Warren pulled Chloe up by her arms, handcuffed her behind her back, and led her weeping and screaming out into the rainy night. The legal fallout was swift, brutal, and absolute. The following morning at 8 o'clock sharp, my attorney, Arthur Vance, arrived at my house with a stack of legal documents 3 inches thick. By noon, we had revoked every power of attorney document Brandon and Chloe had ever touched. We froze the joint checking account, reclaiming the $85,000 Chloe had attempted to transfer to her personal account earlier that week. I filed a formal petition to rewrite my last will and testament. Every square inch of my 300-acre timber property, my house, and my entire financial estate were placed into an irrevocable land trust. Upon my death, the entire property will be permanently preserved as a public wildlife conservation park named after my late wife, Martha Thorne. Chloe was formally and permanently disinherited. The new trust document explicitly states that she is to receive precisely $0.00 from my estate under any circumstances whatsoever. 3 months later, Brandon went to trial. Faced with Frank Huckabee's eyewitness testimony, the forensic evidence of tire tracks on Old Logging Road 9, and the audio recording captured by Trooper Vance's wire, Brandon's defense folded completely. He pled guilty to felony abandonment of an endangered adult and attempted second-degree assault. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had zero tolerance for elder abuse, sentenced Brandon to 9 years in state penitentiary without the possibility of parole for the first 5. While investigating Brandon's finances to establish a motive for the crime, state prosecutors discovered that he had also been quietly embezzling funds from his mortgage firm to cover his massive personal gambling debts. That discovery brought additional federal fraud charges, adding another 4 years to his sentence. Chloe didn't escape justice either. While she avoided the maximum attempted murder charge by agreeing to testify against Brandon, she was convicted of felony reckless endangerment and accessory to elder abuse. She was sentenced to 2 years in county jail, followed by 5 years of strict probation and 300 hours of mandatory community service. When her defense attorney reached out to me 2 weeks before her sentencing, begging me to write a letter of leniency to the judge, I sent back a 1-sentence reply on my attorney's letterhead. She told me to let the frost finish me off. She can let the law finish her. It has been 18 months since that stormy night on Hawthorne Ridge. My hip is healed up completely. I don't need crutches anymore, not even a wooden cane. I walk 2 miles every morning around the perimeter of my timberland, feeling the solid, unyielding earth beneath my boots, breathing in the cold, clean air of the pine forest. Frank Huckabee comes over every Tuesday and Friday morning. We sit on my front porch, drink strong black coffee, and fix up old tractor engines in my barn. 2 old soldiers who know the value of loyalty, dignity, and hard work. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows hard off Hawthorne Ridge and the rain rattles against the window panes, I sit in my leather armchair by the fire and think about what happened. People ask me sometimes, people in town who heard the rumors, how a man survives knowing his own daughter wanted him dead for the sake of a land deed. They ask me if I'm consumed by bitterness, if I hate her for what she did. And I tell them the plain, honest truth. I don't hate her. Hate is a heavy, toxic poison that eats away at the vessel holding it. I forgave her in my heart, not for her sake, but for mine. Carrying hatred around would only ruin whatever good years God has left for me on this earth, and I refuse to give her or Brandon that kind of power over my life. But forgiveness is not the same thing as foolishness. Forgiving someone doesn't mean you open your front door and let them put a knife in your back a second time. The door to my home is locked, the boundaries are drawn, and they will stay drawn until the day I am laid down beside my Martha in the churchyard. The world out there is full of people who measure human worth by the wrong metrics. They look at an old man with a limp or a scarred face, and they see a burden. They see someone who is slow, someone who is in the way, someone whose time has passed. They think that because your body is worn down by years of hard labor, your spirit must be broken too. They are wrong. Your worth as a human being is not determined by how fast you can run, how much money you have in the bank, or how useful you are to people who only care about what you can give them. Your worth is forged in your character, in how you treat people when nobody is watching, and in the quiet strength that keeps you moving forward when the storm is howling and the road beneath your feet gives out. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like a burden just because you need a hand up. And if you ever find yourself standing in the dark on a cold mountain pass, remember this. The storm always passes. The truth always comes to light. And as long as you have breath in your lungs, you are never, ever defeated.